Hey y'all, welcome to the start of a series of videos about American labor. This first video is going to take a look at slavery, as I'm aware that many of you are not American and might not know a lot about slavery in the United States. Because two slaves might have very different lives depending on the crop they were raising, or the size of the farm in which they worked, this video is going to be a bit more generalized than my future videos, but I think it will give you a basic understanding of the life of a slave. Towards the end of the 18th century, the future of slavery was questionable at best. At first glance this seems surprising, but slavery at this point in time was different than slavery in the 19th century. Most slaves during this period were used in the production of tobacco, rice, and indigo, three crops which were both profitable and able to be grown in much of the South. In the 1780s, these crops became less profitable, and it was beginning to appear that the institution of slavery might decline in profitability. Cotton was also a profitable crop during this period, with the South producing some 2 million pounds of it in 1791, but it was only profitable in a relatively small region of the South. Why? Well, to understand this, let's take a look at cotton. There were two main kinds of cotton during this time period. There is Sea Islands cotton and upland cotton. Sea Islands cotton has a silky texture, smooth seeds, and long staple fibers, which makes it easy to pick. This type of cotton is great for bed sheets. This was the most profitable type of cotton, however can only be grown in the rich alluvial soils in the Sea Islands of the Carolinas and Georgia. Growing it inland produced a poorer quality of cotton. Upland cotton has short staple fibers, is strong, and can be grown in most of the South. This is the cotton your flannel shirt is made of. However, upland cotton seeds are sticky and difficult to remove, so much so that one slave could pick up to 300 pounds of cotton a day, while another could only clean 1 pound of cotton in the same amount of time. Eli Whitney was able to solve this problem when he invented a hand-cranked machine that separates the seeds from the fibers. He invented the cotton gin. Now in a single day, a slave could clean 50 to 55 pounds of uplands cotton. This not only made cotton profitable in the existing southern states, but inspired southerners to expand slavery further. This one invention did not just resuscitate slavery, it reinvigorated it. The stereotypical image of the South being a patchwork of only large plantations is false. Slave families who owned 5 to 50 slaves vastly outnumbered the wealthier plantation families that owned well over 50 slaves. In the early 19th century, 1 or 2 slaves on a small farm might perform a variety of tasks, from cooking to caring for crops depending on the day and the season. Small slave owners often worked alongside their slaves, as they needed to produce enough crops in order to feed their families and make a decent profit, as one poor crop season could force the slave owner to sell his slave to cover his debt. Slaves on large plantations performed various tasks around the estate. The experience of a field slave depended on the task system they found themselves under and the crop they were cultivating. Under the task labor system, typically used in rice farming, slaves had a specific task to complete. Once that task was completed, the slave was free to spend the rest of their day as they wished, such as hunting or growing their own crops. This free time was very important for a slave. Masters did as little as possible for slaves, providing them with little more than the clothes on their backs, a ration of 3.5 pounds of salt pork, with some cornbread, and some shelter. Slaves, when they weren't working for their master, still made their own meals, cared for their children, and did any other chores necessary. Despite this, rice cultivation was very challenging and tedious. Male slaves would plow the land, creating rows with deep trenches in between. Then female slaves would have to plant each individual grain of rice in the ground. Over the course of summer, the ground would be repeatedly flooded and hoed until August, when slaves would harvest the rice. Cultivating this crop was harsh, as the work was backbreaking, and slaves often came into contact with diseases like malaria and tuberculosis. For farming cotton, tobacco, and sugar, masters used the gang system. In this system, slaves would work the entire day performing a variety of tasks. After the fields were plowed, tobacco plants that had been grown indoors were planted. It would take several months of hoeing and weeding before the tobacco was harvested and the leaves of the tobacco were prepared for export. Solomon Northup, whose experiences will be expanded upon later in this video, described how slaves would pick cotton from sunrise to the middle of the night, and those that did not pick enough cotton were subsequently whipped. Speaking of whipping, this was only one of the harsh ways slave owners would punish their slaves, usually for work-related reasons. Slaves were also imprisoned, beaten, shot, or maimed. Even after the harvest period, the slaves were still hard at work. During the winter months, buildings and fences would be repaired and the land cleared for the next season. While house slaves were relatively privileged compared to their field counterparts, nonetheless they still faced hard work. In the narrative of James Curry, a fugitive slave, James Curry describes his mother's experiences as a house slave in North Carolina. She would wake up early each morning and prepare breakfast for her master and his family. This included milking 14 cows, churning cream, and preparing the bread. After the master's family finished their breakfast, She cleaned up behind them and prepared breakfast for the slaves. She took care of chores around the big house and cared for children of mothers who worked in the fields from then until it was time to prepare the master's family's dinner. Afterwards, she would prepare the dinner for the slaves, and then she would return to her cabin where she was so tired she was unable to stand. Another woman, Martha Chauveley, recalled her experiences as a house slave. When I was 9 years old, they took me from my mother and sold me. Master Tinsley made me the house girl. I had to make the beds, clean the house, and other things. After I finished my regular work, I would go to the mistress's room, bow to her, and stand there till she noticed me. Then she would say, "Martha, are you through with your work?" I'd say, "Yes, ma'am." She'd say, "No, you ain't. You haven't lowered the shades." I'd then lower the shades, fill the water pitcher, arrange the towels on the washstand, and anything else the mistress wanted me to do. Then she'd tell me that was about all to do in there. Then I would go to the other rooms in the house and do the same things. We weren't allowed to sit down. We had to be doing something all day. Whenever we were in the presence of any of the white folks, we had to stand up. Because female house slaves typically worked close to their master and his family, they also faced sexual assault and rape. Perhaps the most famous case of the sexual exploitation of a slave was the case of Sally Hemings, who likely mothered 6 of Thomas Jefferson's children. The Act prohibiting importation of slaves of 1807, which banned the importation of slaves to the United States, did not end the slave trade within America. In fact, it did not end American involvement in the external slave trade, and records indicate that Americans participated in the Atlantic slave trade until at least 1862, although to a much lesser degree. This act, along with the increased cultivation of cotton and the westward expansion of the United States, resulted in the growth of the internal slave trade by increasing the value of a slave. Slave owners who participated in the slave trade could often make thousands of dollars by selling unneeded slaves, as was often the case in Virginia. Solomon Northup, a free man who was kidnapped and sold into slavery and recounted his experiences in the book 12 Years a Slave, described the scene of a slave market like so. He would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Sometimes a man or woman was taken back to the small house in the yard, stripped, and inspected more minutely. Scars upon the slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit, and hurt his sale. The slave trade led to one of the most depressing parts of this already depressing topic: the separation of slave families. Slave owners often cared little for the status of a slave family, if they even recognized it at all. Slave children were often bought as they cost less than mature slaves, but many slave owners who chose to do so could not afford to buy the child's family. Northup recounts such an instance where a young slave, Randall, was separated from his mother, Eliza, in 12 Years a Slave. A great many times she repeated her former promises, how very faithful and obedient she would be, how hard she would labor day and night to the last moment of her life if he would only buy them all together. But it was of no avail. The man could not afford it. The bargain was agreed upon, and Randall must go alone. Then Eliza ran to him, embraced him passionately, kissed him again and again, told him to remember her, all the while her tears falling on the boy's face like rain. The planter from Baton Rouge, with his new purchase, was ready to depart. "Don't cry, Mama. I will be a good boy. Don't cry," said Randall, looking back as they passed out the door. Another former slave recalled searching for his mother after she was sold away. "Every exertion was made on my part to find her, or to hear some tidings of her, but all my efforts were unsuccessful, and from that day I have never seen or heard from her." Slave families were also severed after their owners died, and some slaves were sold to cover debt. Sometimes slaves were given as gifts to planter newlyweds. Regardless of why they were separated, this act destroyed black families. Despite their situation, slaves engaged in acts of resistance. Slaves would resist by breaking tools, working at a slow pace, and damaging property. Some slaves would set fire to distract their master, while others would steal food. Slave cooks would spit in their master's food, and some even went as far as poisoning their masters. Many slaves ran away, with some successfully escaping to the north and gaining their freedom. The greatest form of resistance was rebellion. Slave revolts struck fear into slave owners and poor Southern whites alike. Though there were relatively few slave revolts, and even fewer succeeded, the ones that did were extraordinary. Many of you are probably familiar with Nat Turner's Rebellion and how it failed. So I want to tell you about an amazing rebellion that succeeded called the Creole Case. The Creole was a brig owned by slave owners Johnson and Epperson and used to transport slaves and cargo from Virginia to other parts of the southern United States. On October 31st, 1841, the Creole and her crew picked up 135 slaves in Virginia and set sail for Louisiana. One of these slaves, named Madison Washington, was a large, strong slave cook who had been recaptured in Virginia. Washington had originally escaped to Canada, but returned to Virginia to rescue his wife, who was still enslaved. During the voyage, Washington was able to trick and overpower the captain and first mate of the Creole. He called upon his fellow slaves to fight the crew and take over the ship. 18 slaves assisted Washington in overpowering the crew, and they were victorious in taking command of the ship. Washington wanted to sail the ship to Liberia, where the American Colonization Society had a settlement and the slaves would be freed, but there was not enough supplies on board to make the voyage. Instead, they had the second mate sail towards the British West Indies, as the United Kingdom had abolished slavery throughout most of the empire by 1834, and any slaves brought to a British port would be free. On November 9th, the ship reached the port in Nassau in the Bahamas, and was boarded by several African soldiers led by a white commander. The slaves were kept aboard the ship while the British investigated the incident. That same day, American Consul John Bacon attended a meeting with the governor of the Bahamas, and was informed that the governor intended to free all the slaves except those who had participated in the mutiny, who would first undergo a trial. Bacon began hatching a plan to prevent the slaves from becoming free. He was able to get 2 boats and a crew together, and planned to take over the Creole and sail it back to the United States. On the morning of November 12th, the 2 American ships approached the Creole lightly armed and prepared to take control of the ship. Luckily, they were spotted, and the soldiers aboard the Creole were alerted. The commander aboard announced to the ships that they would be fired upon by the 20 soldiers if they tried to take the Creole. The Americans stood down and retreated. After this event, the Attorney General informed all of the slaves, with the exception of those involved with the mutiny, that they were free and could leave the ship. Local citizens transported most of the slaves to shore, and many of them immigrated to Jamaica afterwards. Those involved with the mutiny were detained and awaited judgment from authorities in London. By January, the detained men were determined to have been justified in their rebellion to free themselves and declared free. Though they would spend an additional 3 months in jail after being investigated for piracy, the remaining men were freed in April of 1842. I hope that this video gave you some basic knowledge about slavery and the life of a slave. If you want more information about slavery, I can recommend The Price for Their Pound of Flesh by Dana Ramey Berry. 3 books by slaves that I can highly recommend are 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet A. Jacobs, and Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. Thanks for watching. This video was a bit shorter than planned due to some practice-related activities, which I'll explain in an upcoming video. Some creators that have been inspiring me recently are DeadManAnimations, Jett Cloud, Medea Wray, SABER, and Suck My Opinion. You should check out their channels, and I'll link their Patreons below if they got them. The next history-related video is going to cover labor in the North prior to the Civil War. I'm really excited for this one, so I hope you all are too. Until then, later.